I just listened to the audio you're about to hear, and it probably is worth mentioning this is like the third or fourth time I've recorded this. There are no good ways to talk about something like what I'm about to talk about. Maybe this will make more sense in about 45 minutes or so when you've listened to the audio, but I would ask of you graciousness. Because I do truly think that there is something that we can take from this in the midst of all the tragedy and the horror and the things that are happening around us that are just so awful. I do say in here, in 10 years we'll all know what this means. And I hope that there is something positive. And it might be a pie in the sky, a potential reality that is never going to exist. And yet I wonder, if we do not learn from our collective mistakes, and I don't speak about just you and me, I speak about us as a group of people, as a collective. If we don't learn from our collective mistakes, we are going to continue seeing them happen to us over and over and over again. There will be more assassinations, shootings, atrocities, horrific episodes of all shapes, sizes, and colors. And I wonder if there's any way that potentially you and I, on an individual level, can be some of the change in ourselves that we wish to see amongst our society, our culture. If politics is not your cup of tea, maybe skip this one. This is going to touch on some current events. Charlie Kirk's assassination, the assassination of lawmakers in Minnesota a couple months ago, this trend of our inability collectively to disagree in a productive manner. The growing partisan divide as it grows ever wider. I keep thinking it can't get any worse, and then something happens and it feels like it just got worse. What can we do to shrink the partisan divide? What can we do to salvage any moral good from this great evil? For whatever it's worth to you, I'll give you my thoughts. I've titled this rant, Empire of Reason.
Or we may disagree. We are not enemies. We're neighbors. We're friends, co-workers, citizens, and most importantly, we're fellow Americans.
I think I owe you all an apology. I never tried to do a current events show, and I have no intentions of consistently doing a current events show. I have recorded other current events podcasts in the past year or so, and I haven't released them. I don't know if I'll release this one, to be honest with you. There's this polarization and hyper-partisanism that I've been noticing the more I read about America and the more I pay attention and sort of let my ears come up to listen to the tenor of the day and different things like that. And I default to, I have this natural position that says I can read and educate myself and think, but that doesn't mean that I need to be diametrically opposed to my political opponents. I, fervently hold to the idea that we can have conversations, that we can speak with those who disagree with us on topics, and that doesn't mean that we need to hate one another. I think that is a fundamental American characteristic, a characteristic that I think, is hard to find anywhere else. And I'm sure there are places, but I think it is a fundamentally American idea that you and I can sit down at a bar, at a coffee shop, and we can sit down opposed to one another on an issue and still, at the end of the conversation, find common ground because we're Americans. And I'm afraid that, and this has been a long time coming. This is not, the recent news has convinced me that the patient is dead kind of a thing. This is The patient's been bleeding out on the floor for 50, 60, 70 years, and I'm just now speaking about it. Charlie Kirk was shot at a rally in Utah yesterday. You know, I was sitting at work, and you see the video, and I just incapable of doing anything productive. And I didn't want to come on here and just turn this into some sort of a eulogy for a political commentator. But this is a symptom, I think, of this rot that has spread through America to the point where we can't have conversations anymore. And I understand that he's not for everyone, and there are quite a few people out there who felt like Charlie Kirk was a damaging influence on the American people. And I won't disagree that there were times that he said things that you go, ooh, I don't know about that one. But I think if that is your reaction, that there's an individual who said some potentially divisive things and you know, they put out inflammatory rhetoric, and that inflammatory rhetoric came home to roost. If that is where you are with this kind of a thing, I think you fundamentally misunderstood what is so important, what is so fundamental to the American experiment. I think in many ways, the existence of a guy like Kirk is a symptom of this inability to agree to disagree, as it were. He's a provocateur, which is not an insult in and of itself. He plays a role. As a provocateur, he naturally creates many, many enemies, has said things that are, one could say, even problematic. And yet, to sort of put this in perspective, I think I heard this argument made by someone in the past year or so when the punching a Nazi thing was so in vogue. Nazis have become sort of a straw man argument in recent years, it feels like. But also, if you do come across an actual Nazi in the street, I think you and I would both agree, as I'm assuming, making an assumption here, and you know what they say about that, I'm assuming that both of us would vehemently disagree with anything that a Nazi would stand for. The ideology of Nazism is evil. It is anti-human. But if you come across a Nazi in public, the theory went that it was perfectly okay to punch them, to assault them, because they were a Nazi. They forfeited their right to live, to breathe, because of their ideological feelings. And the rebuttal to that, which you can take it or leave it, is, okay, let's say you do punch a Nazi, what happens next? Have you changed anything about how that Nazi feels about any of the things that they feel very strongly about? Have you changed their mind? Probably not. Furthermore, if somebody happens to be standing 5 feet away with a camera and films it, and then the video clip goes viral, is there anything productive that happens because that clip of you punching that Nazi went viral? Again, probably not. So the net return of punching a Nazi is net nothing. In fact, one could probably make a pretty good argument that the only possible outcome of something like that is in some way negative, in that the said Nazi that you've just punched is now more firmly entrenched in their ideology that is so hateful and evil and despicable than they were 3 minutes before you punched them. Because now that you have assaulted them, they're going to dig in their heels. Here's where taking things to intense degrees like this becomes so incredibly damaging. And that's not even just to say that killing someone is wrong, because that goes without saying, but resorting to methods beyond discourse is where things become incredibly damaging, because what is the net result? Is there any good that can come from it? Probably not. You might feel a little bit better about yourself. Maybe you got to get out some of your own anger, but I'd argue you could get more a productive use of that anger by punching a punching bag. Assaulting another human being isn't going to do it for you. Certainly not going to change anything about them, and it's not going to change anything about you, so what's the point? The minute that we allow ourselves to be taken in by a provocateur's words, and we allow those words to then result to us committing some sort of an act of assault or violence, you've lost. It is a net victory for your arguing, your debate opponent, whoever it is, because you've defaulted. It is a default loss of forfeiture. Some call it an ad hominem argument. It is an argument that is defunct on impact. It's something that the minute you say it, you've lost, because it's not even a functioning form of discourse of debate. The minute you spy an ad hominem argument, you go, oh, okay, that person doesn't actually know how to debate. All they know how to do is insult. The reasonable person figures out a way to debate ideas in a forum. The unreasonable person, the person on the fringe, who has no concept of debate, resorts to attacks. I was reading Charlie Sykes' newsletter. He's a left-leaning commentator, vocally against Donald Trump, for whatever that is worth to you. He wrote this passage in his newsletter that I just found so prescient, because I think it puts into words some of what I'm thinking, but does it in a way probably better than I could. He's writing about the ugliness that comes out on social media. First of all, social media is an infernal place, point blank. But there was a noticeable outpouring of negative sentiment in the wake of the killing because, as I said, he was a provocateur. He had enemies. He put out controversial opinions at times into the world, and those controversial opinions were received poorly by a group of people. Sykes wrote this in his newsletter, quote, "But the ugliness was impossible not to notice, giving us a glimpse of the dangerous fissures that have already formed, especially among those who have become numbed to the critical distinction between speech and actual violence." He then quotes a tweet that he tweeted. This is the tweet, quote, "The online ghouls who are celebrating and or justifying the shooting of Charlie Kirk have no idea how much damage they are doing," end quote. He then continues in his newsletter, quote, "I wasn't talking about the damage to their political cause. The folks smirking about Kirk's murder were damaging our moral culture, our sense of shared decency, and the fundamental bedrock of our democracy. If you applauded Kirk's death because of karma or because you despise his politics, you have already embraced a post-democratic world where violence replaces debate and persuasion." He finishes with this. "The belief that we should not murder someone in cold blood is a limiting principle. Liberal democracy has a limiting principle. Terrorism does not." End quote. I think he puts in pretty plain verbiage, in plain terms there, what I am struggling to find the words to say, that the things that go without saying, but deeper than that, the real crime here is a crime against you, me, all of us. It is a crime against our society and our discourse and our culture and any morality that we share with one another. The unfortunate, sad part about all of this, beyond the obvious, is that we are now growing accustomed to this sort of a thing. And here's only in America, right? Only in America will you have a political assassination overshadowing a school shooting. There was a school shooting in Colorado, and news broke about the shooting, just an hour after the assassination attempt in Utah. They say on the news all the time, you're supposed to lead with heat. Heat, heat, heat. It's what gets the clicks, right? So when you go listen to your political commentary podcasts, they're leading with heat. When there's a crime like what happened in Charlotte, North Carolina, you're going to see people lead with heat. What should we have done different? Who's to blame? Who can you get mad at? I'm not going to bring the heat. I am enraged. I will be totally honest with you. I feel just this overwhelming sadness. For one, this senseless act of murder. And two, because what it means for America. The marketing material lied when it said that you had the right to free speech, you had the right of the press. You had the right to foster your own ideas about how you should live your life that were not thrown down on you by the government, not shoved down your throat by an ideological machine. You had the right to go find a political commentator that you aligned with and support the movements that they support. You have the right to organize. These are all fundamental rights. You have the right to gather and share ideas without fear of a bullet. You have a right to speak your mind without fear of the government coming into your home and arresting you for the words that you say. All of these are fundamental American rights. We know this. We intuitively know this. We grow up with it. And yet we sometimes forget or need to be reminded, or you have individuals on the fringes that are dictating how things go for those, the reasonable, in the center. We have this inability to humanize our ideological opponents. Those we disagree with become Nazis, become Hitler 2.0, become Stalin, become Mao. We create these straw men for these individuals and their ideas because we perceive their ideas to be dangerous. I was trying to find a quote and I couldn't find one. I was trying to find a book that says, here's what happens when, Martin Luther King died. Here's the warnings and the signposts, and here's all the things that the American people screwed up. Couldn't find it. But as I was sitting relentlessly scrolling my Twitter feed, which is a mistake in and of itself, I couldn't help but feel this profound sadness, and not just because somebody was killed, but because of what it meant for the American people, because it was a checkup on the American patient. As you play the game of Operation and you're trying to pull out the liver, and you have your little tweezers and the sides are buzzing because you've touched the sides because you can't pull the liver out just quite right. That's what it felt like. It felt like the sides in the game of Operation were buzzing. It's a symptom. And I think there have been several symptoms, and they've been building on one another, but it seems like all of these things have kind of happened consecutively, one after the other. I mean, it was just a couple months ago that lawmakers in Minnesota were shot and killed in their homes. This political violence has to stop. It's not just a right or left thing either. It's a radicalism problem. It's a partisanism problem. It's an ideology issue. It's a sickness where people think that the only way that they can handle issues of disagreement is violence. And violence is never, and it should go without saying, that it's never a response that is acceptable in any way, shape, form, or fashion. We now have lawmakers from Minnesota that their children will now grow up without a parent. Charlie Kirk has 2 children under the age of 5. They now have to grow up without a father. His wife has to carry on without her husband. It's heartbreaking. And furthermore, beyond that, I mean, I've talked about the state of American politics in previous shows that I didn't actually post because, frankly, I was not excited about the idea of talking about current events in any sort of public forum because the public forum is so partisan. We have a presidency, and I've spoken about this, and I created a show about this and just never released it. We have a presidency, we have an executive branch that has far too much power. What does that look like in terms of everyday life? I don't know. It's hard to put all the pieces together and look up and have a picture that makes complete sense because we're too close to it. But I'm sure in 10 years, we'll know exactly what it all meant. We'll be the armchair historians 10 years from now that says, how do we not see the grand picture? I was sitting thinking, like, what makes the American experiment special? What is something that separates it from the rest of the world that, you set up a lineup of America, England, France, Poland, whatever, and they're all represented by individuals standing in a lineup. What's the thing that's going to make America stand out? And it's not the Uncle Sam getup, but something that makes it instantly recognizable compared to other countries of the world. And I keep coming back to this freedom of opinion, this freedom of debate, the freedom of the press. And there's many things. There's many different representative samples of what makes America very special, but it comes down to an individual level. When I'm reading documents from the Founding Fathers, a lot of the things that they point out as both the boon and the thing that is terrifying is that they created this thing and now it's in the hands of the people. The people are able to do with it what they will. And there's always, I think, when reading some of these documents and quotes from men like, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, Washington, Adams, you're reading some of the things that they're writing or saying, and underpinning all of this is maybe a subtle fear that the people won't be able to handle this car that they've been given the keys to. I was looking for a quote. I was looking for something, and I came away with two different ones. And I was looking for something more modern, to be honest with you, but being the history-minded person that I am, I kept going back to the 1800s and earlier. This is from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to John Holmes in 1820. John Holmes was a member of the House of Representatives from Massachusetts. And the content of the letter, we quoted this in To the Sound of Distant Guns, but Jefferson is afraid that differences ideologically surrounding slavery were going to ruin the American experiment. He saw, I guess, the writing on the wall that said these ideological differences would not be able to coexist, that Americans would fracture the country and the entire American ideal would go down the waste bin because of slavery. And we can read into that a little bit with some of our modern ideals and say, well, let's put this on a triage list. Hey, slavery's terrible, so maybe let's get rid of that, and then come what may, right? But it is rooted in this fundamental American ideal that we can disagree and we can still coexist with one another, and we don't have to wreck everything around us because of our disagreement. And I think it's so poignant, and it's probably a quote that you can pull out of the bag, every 6 months or so and say, hey, look, Thomas Jefferson was scared about partisanism in 1820. It was the wrong issue, clearly, but we can look at the spirit of the quote and say, okay, maybe, the application was wrong, but the spirit was right. Jefferson was on to something, at least broadly, when he was saying this. Here's what Thomas Jefferson wrote to John Holmes. Quote, I regret that I'm now to die in the belief that the useless sacrifice of themselves by the generation of 1776 to acquire self-government and happiness to their country is to be thrown away by the unwise and unworthy passions of their sons, and that my only consolation is to be that I live not to weep over it. If they would but dispassionately weigh the blessings they will throw away against an abstract principle more likely to be affected by union than by schism, they would pause before they would perpetrate this act of suicide on themselves and of treason against the hopes of the world. End quote. What's he saying there? Jefferson, in his triage list, at the very top of the list, he says the thing that must be protected above everything else is our collective union, is the American experiment, the thing that the generation of 1776 put together, the infant that they all bore together. That infant must be protected in its cradle, and he was afraid that, with disagreements about slavery, that the infant would get strangled in its cradle, that the unwise passions of the generation after 1776 would ruin the whole thing. And we quoted that line into The Sound of Distant Guns because, I had the question, did he see what was on the horizon? Did he see the great Civil War that would eventually come to America? Did he know that the thing that the Founding Fathers failed to do was, dummy-proof the American experiment? Did they put guardrails on it that says, hey, let's not ruin this whole thing. Let's put in guardrails that say you can't go to war with, or create scenarios where civil war could be avoided. When we kill political commentators because the things they say are dangerous, I find myself in a similar situation where I'm sending messages to my constituents and friends, and I'm saying, I don't know if the patient's going to make it. And in 10 years, we're going to know how this all played out. We're going to know what it all meant. But right now, it seems very obvious to me that America has a communication problem. One spouse isn't communicating with the other and vice versa. This thing is a two-way street where it takes two sides to tango, but we've almost created these idols of disagreement. You've got, and I've heard it described this way, that you've got this ship. The American concept is a ship, and there's this ballast that is keeping the ship afloat. And the ballast is weighed on one side by left-leaning ideology and on the other side by right-leaning ideology. And then in the middle, this ballast is balanced collectively by the opinions of the people on the ship, keeping this thing afloat. And the ballast is now out of balance and the ship is listing. Is it going to survive? It's hard to know. And it's deeply frustrating. Not least among which, because you have a 31-year-old man who's a father and a husband who's killed because he, speaks controversial statements into the void because he fosters debate. I found another quote too. This is from a speech that Benjamin Franklin wrote and then was delivered at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. In fact, it was September 17th, 1787. Fall is in the air. There's no pumpkin spice lattes, but, the air is brisk. And this is, to give it some context, the Constitutional Convention has just adopted the Constitution. And there's a deep partisan divide about the Constitution. In fact, Benjamin Franklin opens his remarks here by saying that he's not fully convinced the Constitution's great, but it's the best we could have done. You have men on either side of this political divide at the convention that have their own ideas about how this thing should be done, and they disagree with one another. And Benjamin Franklin, after the Constitution's been adopted, he writes this speech where he essentially says we have to agree to disagree on some of these things. In fact, he even says it better than I could. He says we need to doubt our own infallibility. I'll pull a couple different quotes from this. Benjamin Franklin wrote this September 17th, 1787, quote, "Most men indeed, as well as most sects in religion, think themselves in possession of all truth, and that wherever others differ from them, it is so far error. Steele, a Protestant, in a dedication tells the Pope that the only difference between our two churches in their opinions of the certainty of their doctrine is the Roman Church is infallible and the Church of England is never in the wrong. But though many private persons think almost as highly of their own infallibility as that of their sect, few express it so naturally as a certain French lady who in a little dispute with her sister said, 'But I meet with nobody but myself that is always in the right.'" He would end his speech by saying this, quote, "On the whole, sir, I cannot help expressing a wish that every member of the convention who may still have objections to it would with me on this occasion doubt a little of his own infallibility, and to make manifest our unanimity to put his name to this instrument." End quote. I'll confess to you, I'm operating out of a sense of collective identity. And not everybody is. Not everybody looks across at their political and ideological opponents and says, we're all in this together. Clearly not everybody does that. But I'll confess to you that I do, because anytime I'm reading anything, and maybe this is a pie in the sky, this is wishful thinking. Anytime I read anything about what America is and what it was meant to be, I keep coming back to this idea that there is this collectiveness, there is this Americanness that is centrally found in our ability to agree on basic principles. And that when we don't agree, we never doubt our own infallibility. We say, I'm in the right and you're in the wrong, and it results in this. It results in tragedy. Because when we disagree and we point across the aisle and say, you are, insert straw man argument here, and then we point back at our opponents and insert another straw man argument here, it creates what feels to be an unbridgeable divide, and the ballast is thrown off balance. And then what happens inevitably is you get mentally unstable individuals that take it upon themselves to satisfy the argument once and for all. And then everything is thrown into the lurch. And I was looking for a solution. I was trying to find something that would, offer some solace or help, or because I find it so difficult when I'm listening to commentators speak about things and all they ever do is fearmonger. All they ever do is point out all the things that are wrong, but they don't offer a solution in any shape or form. And all they say is, the sky's falling because of the right, because of the left. I feel like that is such a pointless use of a voice just to say that there are things wrong. Clearly, we can all point out different things that are wrong. I can walk into a grocery store tomorrow and I can point out things that are wrong. I think it is a natural human state that we can point out things that are wrong. I probably sit around the dinner table with my wife and we point out things that are wrong every day. Because it's so easy to do, right? But what's difficult? What's difficult is finding solutions. And I was trying to find one for this conversation because I don't want to come on here and just rage bait, point out the things that I'm angry about, and then just say, well, okay, have a good day, carry on with your life. It seems such a waste of this microphone, whatever it's worth. I think the thing that the Founding Fathers all feared was a populace that was no longer capable of managing this government that they'd been given. As Benjamin Franklin writes in that same address, he says this, quote, I think a general government necessary for us, and there is no form of government but what may be a blessing to the people if well administered, and I believe, farther, that this is likely to be well administered for a course of years, and can only end in despotism, as other forms have done before it, when the people shall become so corrupted as to need despotic government, being incapable of any other. Noah Webster, in 1787 in October, delivered similar sentiments when he said this, quote, in the formation of such a government, it is not only the right, but the indispensable duty of every citizen to examine the principles of it, to compare them with the principles of other governments, and with a constant eye to our particular situation and circumstances, and thus endeavor to foresee the future operations of our own system and its effects upon human happiness. End quote. Webster also says this in the same speech, and I find that it rings incredibly true of today. Quote, but men are ever running into extremes. The passions, after a violent constraint, are apt to run into licentiousness, and even the reason of men who have experienced evils from the defects of a government will sometimes coolly condemn the whole system. End quote. I suppose if we are doing our own triage list of what is most important here, it's, in my mind, the preservation of the American ideal, of the American experiment, because I don't know about you, I can't speak for everybody listening, but I am deeply convinced that the American idea is worth protecting, that the constitutional idea of America, and I'm trying to learn more and more about it each day because it is not a simple thing. The marketing material for America is not simple. It is complex, and there's a lot to it. And as time goes on and the Constitution becomes, somewhat different depending on the time in which you're looking at it, and you're trying to reckon, well, what is a constitutional idea? How does that work in 2025 when the world is fundamentally different? I keep coming back to the idea is worth protecting. And essential to that idea is freedom of speech and disagreement. The idea that you and I can sit across from each other and disagree, but that we as men and women of reason can come to reasonable conclusions about one another, that we can see an earnest faith, the American idea can be preserved. If we're all working on the same basis, right? Partisan divides no longer matter. Personal wealth and gain no longer matter because we're all working from the same perspective. We're all working from the perspective that America, that the things that we were founded upon, that the things that our government was founded upon are worth protecting because they're unique. They've never been duplicated. It seems to me we also have a personal responsibility as citizens to, one, be educated about what it is that's going on around us, and two, to maybe doubt our own infallibility a little bit. I think you and I probably would disagree on some issues and topics, topically. But if we were to come together at the end of it, could we, shake hands and say, I still respect you, I still consider you a friend. Our friendship, our communion with one another as human beings is not ruined by this difference in ideals. To me, that is fundamental to American ideals. And when we lose the ability to do that, we are losing a piece of ourselves. We are losing a piece of our collective reason. And I think when we allow the unreasonable to dictate what the reasonable will do, we have entered a very dangerous place indeed. I'll close with this next quote by Noah Webster in that same speech I've been quoting, where he says, "The origin of the American Republic is distinguished by peculiar circumstances. Other nations have been driven together by fear and necessity. The governments have generally been the result of a single man's observations or the offspring of particular interests. In the formation of our Constitution, the wisdom of all ages is collected. The legislators of antiquity are consulted, as well as the opinions and interests of the millions who are concerned. In short, it is an empire of reason." End quote. I'll be honest with you. I'll level with you. I'm deeply concerned, and I don't know what happens next. I'll confess to you that I feel a deep sense of anger, but it seems to me that this empire of reason is under attack by the unreasonable, and the unreasonable are dictating what the reasonable will do. And anytime I have read about situations where the unreasonable take over the center, things become dangerous. So I would urge anyone listening, if, I wanted to offer a solution such as it is, for whatever it's worth. Maybe the solution for some of these issues is to be found in some of those founding documents where these founders turned to one another, educated men, reasonable men, turned to one another and said, is it perhaps possible to doubt some of our own infallibility? And furthermore, if we look in the mirror and we see the face staring back at us, can we look in the mirror and ask ourselves the question, the very difficult question, can this empire of reason that I wish to see start with me? To close this thing out, because I did promise that I would offer solutions and attempt not to fearmonger or turn this sort of a conversation into a heat kind of a conversation. I find that many times when ideologies take over the center, or the radicals on if the horseshoe theory is what you subscribe to, on the two ends of the horseshoe or on the far right, far left, when the radicals overtake the moderates, when reason goes out the window, it tends to happen because humans are dehumanized and we forget to find our humanity in one another. I've been studying quite a bit about the Civil War in recent months, and so naturally my mind returns to quotes made by men who were discussing matters of humanity at that time. William Seward was foremost among these men. If you don't know who William Seward was, he was Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State. He was the favorite to be the Republican nominee for president in Chicago in 1860. And Abraham Lincoln, to surprise everyone, edged him out to be the next nominee, and he made Seward his Secretary of State. William Seward was the foremost abolitionist voice in the 1800s. He was hated universally by the South for comments made in defense of abolition. One of the things that Seward mentioned in his comments and speeches was this humanization of African Americans, of slaves. This was not a common view. In fact, it made him unpopular politically because his constituency, the people he was speaking to, were a white electorate, and this was a racist white electorate. People living at the time were almost exclusively racists. So if you were to go back and try and find a friend among people living at the time, you'd be hard-pressed. The common mode of thinking at the time was one that was abhorrent. We talked about this quite a bit in To the Sound of Distant Guns Part 1. We did not talk about William Seward a ton, and I think in a moment like this, he has a few quotes that I think would bring some solace, at least when we're trying to humanize those that oppose us or seem different from us. Here's a quote that William Seward gave in one of his speeches. Quote, "The color of the prisoner's skin and the form of his features are not impressed upon the spiritual immortal mind which works beneath. In spite of human pride, he is still your brother and mine, in form and color accepted and approved by his father and yours and mine, and bears equally with us the proudest inheritance of our race, the image of our Maker. Hold him then to be a man." End quote. What he's getting at there is that in times like this, we are reminded that there is a higher power to all of this. Whether you subscribe to it or not, there is a supernatural element here. An intrinsic element of the human condition is searching for that supernatural element, for that reflection. C.S. Lewis is somebody that I return to often in times like this of crisis or of unease, because he spoke so often and was living through a period of great unease in World War II when everything seemed like it was on the brink, when organized society and civil society felt like it really could be upended, that evil would win. And ideologues at the time were arguing about, what do we do? And how do we approach these very political ideals? And C.S. Lewis oftentimes would return to the supernatural to answer some of these questions, to answer the aggrievedness of the situation, to answer the unease and unrest. C.S. Lewis has this quote where he's talking about the war, and I think it's fair to substitute when he says war for this political divide that we're feeling as Americans. So I'll substitute it in the moment. I'll just substitute war for unrest. And here's what C.S. Lewis says, quote, "The unrest creates no absolutely new situation. It simply aggravates the permanent human situation so that we can no longer ignore it. Human life has always been lived on the edge of precipice. Human culture has always had to exist under the shadow of something infinitely more important than itself." End quote. And to your point of comfort, I return often. There's a quote that C.S. Lewis gave where he's talking about in the years after World War II, where he's talking about the atomic bomb and just constant fear-mongering, hatred of what could, potentially come, but this pervading unease. C.S. Lewis gives, I think, one of my favorite quotes about how to deal with unease in general. And I know there's a lot of things to digest, and many people are demanding action. They're demanding that something be done to change the status quo because the status quo is insufficient. And I would agree that the status quo is insufficient. I think I've spoken now for 30 minutes about how the status quo is insufficient. But there's something to be said for finding peace in your everyday life, for finding it in the people around you, for finding it in the supernatural, for finding it in faith. And C.S. Lewis says that, when things like this come, let us be found doing sensible things. So to close, here's what C.S. Lewis says about unrest. Substitute the atomic bomb for unrest and see if it gives you some comfort. Quote, "This is the first point to be made, and the first action to be taken is to pull ourselves together. If we are all going to be destroyed by an atomic bomb, let that bomb, when it comes, find us doing sensible things. Praying, working, teaching, reading, listening to music, bathing the children, playing tennis, chatting to friends over a pint and a game of darts. Not huddled together like frightened sheep and thinking about bombs. They may break our bodies, but they may not dominate our minds." End quote.